In my writing, I am centering Black women's lives. I am centering those lives in a time period or in a historical era in which it's difficult to see them, but in which I know, and I believe we all know now, that those women were there.
That is an excerpt from an interview with 2024 MacArthur Fellow Jennifer L. Morgan, a historian deepening understanding of how the system of race-based slavery developed in early America. Using a range of archival materials and what is missing from them, she brings to light enslaved African women's experiences during the 16th and 17th centuries. In this episode, we go in depth with Jennifer to learn more about her work, and her exceptional creativity. Let's hear more from her interview.
When we think about slavery or slave labor, we imagine men. We imagine men working. And that's in part because of the way that we have inherited ideas of what hard work, manual labor looks like. It's really important, I think, to understand that in the first decades and centuries of the slave trade to the Americas, there were many, many women on board those ships. And in fact, the way that early slave owners understood slave labor involved the use of women in the fields doing hard manual labor. I think that if we fail to see that, if we fail to understand the role of women in building these economies, we are missing a huge component of what made those early sugar and tobacco economies work. My focus on enslaved women has allowed me to center the ways in which work and reproduction and intimacy are also at the heart of an economic system of slavery and slave labor. I think that the focus on women opens our vision not only on those individual women's lives, which are important for their own sake, but also on the lives of the men and the children and the slave owners and the free laborers who interact with them as we're watching this system of hereditary racial slavery unfold in the colonies, both in North America and in the Americas writ large. One of the things that any historian of slavery immediately confronts is the way that the archive is not really open to answering the questions that we want to ask. There's a violence in bookkeeping when it comes to the buying and selling of human beings. There's a technology of erasure that we find in the colonial logbook. There's a technology of erasure that we find in the balanced accounts of a plantation handbook. It means that I'm confronted with a narrow range of evidence that's often economic, right? It's bills of sale, it's political and economic correspondence between colonial governors and slave ship captains. The refusal of slave owners or slave traders to focus on or to describe or to attend to the women and men and children that they were buying and selling and transporting is indeed part of how racial slavery works. In order to construct a social history of Black women from that archive, you have to read that archive for its absences and for its silences, and recognize that the silence is actually an apparatus of control. In Laboring Women, I was compelled by a little piece of evidence, right? Which was that in the first century or century and a half of the slave trade, there's evidence that there were more women on board those slave ships than would be the case as you move into the 18th century, right? So there were more women who were part of those initial folks who were captured by the Spanish, by the Portuguese, by the Dutch, by the English. That caused me to ask, well, what is the impact then of those women's lives on, again, these sort of early decades of slave ownership, of enslaved labor? And one of the things that became clear to me is that in the English records, planters described women's unborn children as part of their inheritance. The metaphor that I used was that the slave owner was reaching into that woman's future and saying, whoever you give birth to belongs to me and my children. And it was a way of separating out her children from his children, right? His children would be the owners of her children. The first child that shall happen to be born of my Negro woman Mary will go to my son. The second child that shall happen to be born of my Negro woman Mary will go to my daughter, right? So it's a way of enlarging his wealth through his imagination. But it's also a way of shackling that woman to her reproductive capacity. So I started to think about that a lot and to think about what it meant to be that woman, to know or to understand that it's not just you who are enslaved, it's your progeny, it's your future. That is an enormous source of wealth and confidence for early slave owners. A slave owner who maybe only is wealthy enough to own one or two people can still imagine and actually make real his future wealth through the body of an enslaved woman. It starts with the assumption that one person can own not just your body, but all that your body can produce. The work of your hands and the work of your womb. Reckoning with slavery starts from the insight that I brought to laboring women. I am arguing that if we understand slavery to be at the foundation of modern capitalism, which many of us do, we have to understand the role of women in that foundational moment. All that is developing in the context of racial slavery is dependent on the reproductive capacities of enslaved Black women. And if that is the case, we have to understand the intersection between Black women's capacity to produce kinship and the market's capacity to reduce Black women and children and men to capital. And that conflict, the conflict between kinship and capitalism, is at the core of the history of early modern slavery and at the core of the history of early modern capitalism. For some people, my work on the history of early modern slavery might feel very far away from the present, from the current moment. But as we know about the Black maternal mortality crisis in this country, African American women's reproductive capacity has always been imperiled and continues to be a point of really important political engagement, both for me and I think for us all in the country. Slave owners produced stereotypes about Black women's bodies. Slave owners claimed that African women gave birth without pain. They claimed that African women could work from sunup to sundown without injury. They claimed that Black women didn't care about the death of their own children. They claimed that Black women were completely content to provide breast milk and nurture to white women's children. There were all sorts of claims about Black women not being real mothers. And those claims seep into the ways in which Black women and other women of color navigate their reproductive lives in the here and now. I think that the connection between the history of slavery and the way in which we understand maternity and motherhood right now is very apparent. I've begun to write a little bit more about reproductive justice. I've begun to write a little bit more about the connection between the history of slavery and the current attack on reproductive freedom. I think that those connections are really crucial, and I think that those of us who have concerns about Black women and other women's reproductive justice in the here and now need to understand the history of slavery and of racial stereotype that comes out of the history of slavery. I hope that people who encounter my work understand that I'm making an argument that Black women were world makers, that Black women's presence in the Atlantic changes things, and as a result, all sorts of things unfold. Ideas of value or ideas of exchange are connected to ideas of kinship, to who is a legitimate member of a family and who isn't. There's an incredible violence at the heart of racial slavery. It's the violence that says that a person's life is not measured by how they're connected to a family, a community, a village, a town, a nation, but is rather only important because of how much they are worth. We've come to a point now where we all can say, like, human beings should not be bought and sold. But if we look carefully, we see that human beings are bought and sold all the time, that we have decided that some people are worth more in our society, in our world, than others. That is a tendril. It's one of the many tendrils, the afterlife of slavery. It's one of the ways in which we have to grapple with what slavery has left us. And that is a form of dehumanization that is still really, really alive and with us.
Jennifer L. Morgan is a professor of history in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis in the Department of History at New York University. She is currently working on The Eve of Slavery, a book about African women in 17th century North America. The MacArthur Fellows program identifies and supports extraordinarily creative individuals with a track record of excellence who demonstrate the ability to impact society in significant and beneficial ways through their pioneering work. To learn more, visit us at macfound.org.